Well, welcome to the Burn Up Podcast. It's a privilege and an honor to have Jeff Kirkham with me here today. Jeff, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to get into Jeff's story. Jeff's got a fascinating story. He's a 28-year, Green Beret vet. He's a best-selling author, which one of his books is now getting turned into a movie. We're going to hear all about it. He's the co-founder of Rewilding, which in Utah is how would you describe Rewilding?
It's a personal development wellness retreat. That's immersive 3-4 day retreat that people come and learn how to be better.
Yeah, love it. And he's an entrepreneur, has a company called Ready Man. We're going to get into all different things and talk a lot about, actually what I want to do today, we'll just kind of jump into this is, before you and I started recording here, we were talking about fear a little bit. And, many times when we're scared of something, we're frozen. And that fear really is just, it's worry about something that may or may not happen, but it can keep us frozen. And, it's interesting in day-to-day life, we can be scared of lots of different things, whether it's conversation, am I going to be able to pay my bills? Am I this or that? But again, being an active military, because you were active for 10 years actually in combat?
Yeah. So the last 13 years I was in a counter-terrorist unit, and I spent the majority of that 13 years in the war, either in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Africa.
Okay. So again, you've been involved in active combat, had that. It's a different level of, we'll call it fear, right? It's different. And so what does someone do, you personally, and even from a military perspective, how do you find peace? How do you able to actually lean into that many times when your life's on the line?
I think it's one of those things where fear is an emotion, right? So you get a feeling that builds up, and that feeling is kind of like the bing on your cell phone that tells you that there's a message there. And so that may be the butterflies, or kind of like that bing. And until you kind of start looking at it, you don't know what that emotion is, right? So for example, if you've ever been married or met a girl for the first time or something, you have butterflies. That's a feeling, right? And then also it's like being on a helicopter at 2:00 in the morning, flying in on a target. You got butterflies. Same feeling, different message, right? And so, and that emotion, that a message, that fear that's there. And so, how do you deal with it? Well, the first way to deal with it is recognize that it's there, and then to recognize that it's there to protect you. So these emotions that are there, that are built into us as human beings, are there. So it's either to help us to connect with somebody that's there, loved one or whatnot, or to protect us from potential danger that's there. So when that fear kicks in, then, just a tad of the science, you start getting in, your cortisol starts flowing through the body, which is adrenaline, that then turns the brain on. It elevates all of the senses so that essentially I'm ready to fight that saber-toothed tiger. So it's just accepting it without allowing it to take control of it, because you're learning from it and understanding it's there to help you. It's not there to hinder you.
It's interesting, again, in a military position, fear obviously is valid. Well, I'll use the word valid. Many times when it comes to fear, and again, students, my understanding is you're studying for psychology right now, or
yeah. So I just finished my master's in nursing. So I'm a nurse. I'm an RN. I just finished my master's in nursing. I'm about halfway through my master's in psychology, and then I'm going back and I'm getting my nurse practitioner.
Yeah. Along those lines with fear, what I've found in my own life is many times that fear, that frozen state, the butterfly, feeling that you mentioned, but many times it's not yes, it's a feeling, it's there to help me keep me safe. But many times it's like, well, I already am safe. Like, it's not even warranted necessarily to feel fear. It's the natural reaction to feel it, but it's also just a story that I'm attaching to it.
Absolutely. So, and that's where you've got to be able to look at that emotion that's going on, in this case, fear, and then be able to dissect that and go, well, where is this coming from? Because if I'm in a safe place, why am I experiencing this? Because a lot of these emotions that we have are old patterns that are in our life that then all of a sudden just continue on. And so they were serving us at one point in our life, that then all of a sudden, because they've kept with us and they've become somewhat chronic, that all of a sudden they're still with us, but they're not serving us in the way that they were before. And so that's where, if you can look at them and then figure out and go, okay, what is this trying to teach me? And then all of a sudden it allows us to downregulate or downshift from what that is and go, oh, this isn't really fear. This may be just something that's uncomfortable to me, or this may be something that may be associated with anxiety. And so we get this conflagration of what's happening with the emotions, because as guys, what we tend to do is we tend to ignore them, which is just a fancy way of saying we compartmentalize them. And so when we continue to compartmentalize these emotions, they just build up, build up, build up, build up. And we see this at the retreat at the rewilding, Mustang Medicine rewilding, where as they continue to build up, the very thing that men tend to be overrepresented in this, at least in my experience, is the very thing that they were trying to control, compartmentalize these emotions, ends up building up in bricks and bricks, and that weight of the bricks ends up crushing them. And then the very thing they were trying to control ends up controlling them until they can identify and start working through that.
That's where a lot of addiction's rooted in that.
Sure, yeah, because they're trying to maneuver around those emotions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the avoidance of it.
Or trying to avoid it, or be distracted from it, or numb it down. Absolutely.
The irony in that whole thing too is, especially around addiction, because I've had my own, through a lot of my pain and battled with certain things, and really, looking back on it, I just didn't. It's funny. We turn to whatever that happens to be, behavior, substances. We want to avoid the pain. We don't want to feel, but then we feel. It's that's an initial dopamine hit, but it's temporary. And it doesn't last. And in essence, when anyone gets into an addictive cycle, whatever that happens to be, or a cycle of avoidance, it's inevitable that it'll catch up with us. I loved how you said that. It's like something that we're trying to control ultimately, or not want to control, ultimately will end up controlling us as a result of that. And I've just learned that, everybody's different, but for me personally, it's like, I got to rip the Band-Aid off, whatever that happens to be, and be okay being uncomfortable, allowing myself just to feel. And when you can be in that state, more often than not, you can move through uncomfortable positions or uncomfortable situations pretty quickly when you just allow it to be, hey, it's okay. Yes, I'm uncomfortable. I don't like it, but I'm accepting the fact that I'm uncomfortable, and just accepting it. It's fascinating how the universe just moves that through you.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny is like, veterans and first responders that come through the retreat, and guys too, you start talking about emotions, and you can almost hear their eyes roll in the back of their head. They're like, oh boy, here we go, some hippie stuff. And I'll bring up, and I'm like, well, have you ever been on a traffic stop that was a little bit sketchy? It was dark, it was night, there was, obviously potentially dangerous guys that were in the car. Did you have some fear? And they're like, well, yeah. And it's like, okay, well, did you ignore that fear? And they're like, well, no. And I was like, okay, well, why didn't you ignore that fear? And it's like, well, because that fear it's tuning me up. It's keeping me cautious. And I'm like, okay, so you're not ignoring that emotion. So you have fear. Everybody has fear. That's super common. Like every target I ever went on in the 13 years I was in the counter-terrorist unit, I had fear with every one of those targets. Courage is understanding the fear or accepting the fear and doing it anyways. And you may have fear before you have a football game, or you could have whatever that is. So we accept fear, and we use that, and we use courage to do it anyways. So that's an emotion. It's like, okay, I can see that. So why do we discount all the other ones? And the problem is we discount them at our own, demise, really, if it builds up for too long of a period of time, because all of them are there to help us. And we have to be able to get in there and accept them and look at them as a piece of information that's coming in, because so many times, like guys, especially in a fearful situation, right, or a high stress situation, right, we rely on the physical aspect. I'm strong enough, I'm trained enough, I'm going to be able to get through this. But so many times we see this in like firearms training and stuff like that, where it's like, well, why didn't he just shoot him? And it's like, well, okay, let's talk about that. So you've got the physical down, maybe yes, maybe no. Let's talk about the psychological ramifications after what you do. because now you've got to deal with what you just did. So weeks, months, years afterwards. And let's talk about the emotional impact of what that was and just happened. That's going to affect you and your relationship with your family, your wife, your kids, or your other coworkers or whatnot as the stress continues to build up. And if we go through life ignoring the three, if we go through life ignoring two out of the three of those pillars, which many guys do, guilty, which many guys do, then what happens is like a stool, and that stool begins to topple over. It's unbalanced. And the whole key to all of this, right, is we stay balanced in life. And really, when we're balanced, that's where peace manifests.
Yeah. Harmony, right?
Harmony, yeah, absolutely.
Curious, like from a military perspective, right? We're talking about emotions, that it's okay to be scared. I mean, to have all these things. But, if you're, again, and I'm probably not going to word this right, obviously as a non-military person, but you're going into, say, a combat situation, right? And you've got a group, you've got your team, and you've got somebody there that's frankly freaking out, scared to death. Like, are they even, is there space for someone to feel those feelings, or it's like you just have to shut that off in that moment? Is it, many times, again, society pressures, and I think this is changing, that it's not okay sometimes for men to show their emotions, to show their fears. You got to be this rock solid, like, I've got this, even though inside you might be dying, but you're not allowed to show that. It's not safe to show that. But when you're in a combat situation, like, is there room to, or like, if someone happens to be like not in the best headspace, how is that approached?
So, it's interesting. So I was just quoted by a really good friend of mine on a podcast where it's psychology is as infectious as the flu. And this is one of the things that I used to tell my guys that when I was a team sergeant. And what that means is, as a leader, you could be scared blind inside, but you're not showing it because that emotion will become infectious. And we now know the science behind that, right? We now know that cortisol starts exuding from the body. So for example, if you ever walked into a room and you could cut the tension with a knife, nobody was saying anything, you walked in, you're like, ooh, there's some tension that's going on. That's actually is a very real phenomena. Up until a few years ago, we thought, well, that's just the energy of the room and you're reading the room. Well, we now know that cortisol starts to leach out from the body, and it will infect the people in the room, and their bodies will start giving off cortisol too, which, if you think about it, makes a whole heck of a lot of sense. If I'm sensing danger, then I need to let you know that I'm sensing danger so that we can get prepared to fight the saber-toothed tiger. So it makes sense because it's a survival thing. The problem is it becomes chronic and whatnot and starts affecting us. So as a leader, back to your original thing, it's controlling that, yes, because remember what courage is. Courage does not mean not having fear. And I would argue that the guys that go out there and don't have any fear, you got to kind of look at them with kind of a jaundiced eye, because they may not be the person that you want to go in, because they can be a little bit reckless. That's there. It's like, hey, let's calm down. Let's slow down. In combat, I have yet to see somebody move slow. Doesn't happen. The problem overwhelmingly that happens is people are moving too fast. They're overdriving their headlights, as we like to say. And so they're moving from a bad situation, and because they're moving too fast, they can move into a worse situation. So the problem is not moving fast enough. The problem is slowing down and having the cognitive ability to assess what's going on before you start making decisions and being too rash in that. And the stress that's there can lead to that. And as a leader, as I'm setting the example, and I firmly believe the most powerful thing we can do to change the world, our world and the world around us, is set the example. And this doesn't mean that I'm suppressing those emotions. It just means I'm controlling them at the time so that I'm not negatively affecting the people that are around me.
You just said something that's pretty powerful. I want to hit on this more. Not suppressing versus controlling.
Yeah.
There's a powerful distinction between those two, because again, many times we could think that we're controlling them by suppressing them. Right? how would you articulate the difference between suppressing versus control?
Well, I'll tell you, like, I was in Afghanistan, I can't remember what year it was. I was in Afghanistan. We were flying in on helicopters. It was a multi-ship, helicopters are called ships. It was a multi-ship assault that we were moving in on. We were in CH-47s, which are the Chinooks with the dual rotors. The rear tailgate was down. I'm sitting next to the rear gunner on the back. There's like windows in the back of the helicopter, and he's got the minigun set up here, and I'm looking out the tailgate because I was the last guy in, and then I'd be the first guy out when we got to the target. And so it's the middle of the night. I'm wearing night vision goggles. Everything's like green and hazes of green, and it seriously looks like we're so close to the ground that it looks like you could go, are we like on our wheels driving up? But it's a river and rocks and stuff. And the helicopter is doing this as we're going up. We're flying up Jalalabad Canyon because we're on a target up into the east side of Afghanistan. And I was like, holy cow, we are right on the deck. This is amazing. And I get into this curiosity of like, man, these pilots are really good. And then I looked out the side window where the gunner was, and it literally looked like the wall of the canyon was from me to you. And it scared the bejesus out of me. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, we are going to crash and die before we even get to the target. Screw the bad guys with bullets. And I sat back, and I kind of had to take some deep breaths, and I turned my night vision up so that I couldn't see anything, so that I could kind of collect myself. And it was one of those moments where it was like, okay, breathe through it. These guys are, and and you start going through, and it's like, okay, breathe through this. Everything's fine. These guys are great pilots. We're going to get there. Don't worry about it. Meanwhile, the helicopter is doing this as we're flying up this canyon. And then it was kind of composed myself, and I was like, oh, okay. Because it caught me so off guard looking out that side window, where it was just like one of those like moments of like, oh my gosh, we're going to crash and die. That is one of those. And at that point, I'd been in the war for years, so I was very experienced. But it was still one of those moments that, like, I just absolutely was not prepared for. And then all of a sudden, going, okay, here's this emotion of fear. How are you going to handle it? So I sat back, started using some tools, breathing, visualization, calming, whatnot. Did a little bit, lift the night vision off so I could remove a little bit of the stimulus that was coming in, the visual stimulus that was coming in. You couldn't hear anything. The engines were so loud. Removed some of the visual stimulus that was coming in, calmed everything down, and it was like, oh, okay. And then NVG's back on, and then we hit the target.
What I love that you said too, which is something I'm practicing just on a day-to-day basis, is when different emotions come up, is curiosity. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, many times what I've found, like, if I'm getting in my head, for example, and then, I can have a tendency to be a head case and just start to, go down a rabbit hole, and then it just like, and my default in the past was like, when I got caught into that, when I could catch myself, I'm shaming myself, or I'm angry that I'm there. And by shaming it or judging it, if you will, it actually intensified. And it was introduced to the concept. It was like, well, just get curious about it. Just notice it. It doesn't. And when you shift to curiosity, it's just like, you acknowledge it. Don't judge it. I mean, if you can remove the judgment from it and just get curious about it, it's fascinating, because then you get to just see it from a different perspective. It's like, what is this? It's like, this is just me, or it's just a story, or it's an old way of doing things. And then I love that you said too, there's so many, we many times we're searching outside of us to try to calm us and do whatever. But the reality is, like, naturally we have so many things we can turn to. Use breath work, breathing, like getting recentered, how we control our mindset with all of it. I mean, there's so many ways that we can recenter ourselves that's not even completely outside of us. But the thing that you said that resonates with me, which I'm practicing now, is just curious, like, what is that?
Curiosity is the antidote to so many of the negative emotions that come up. And I'm hesitant to say negative emotions. Curiosity is the antidote to an emotion that is affecting you in a negative way. And this is one of the big lessons that we teach at the retreat is, if modern society, and we teach this class, and it's called the trigger box, and I'll give you the real broad spectrum on this, and this was it came from a dream that I had when I was up in the mountains camping, and at the actually almost a year ago today. And modern society says, you're triggering me. You have to stop doing what you're doing. You have to stop saying what you're saying. You need to change how you're thinking. You need to change the way that you're acting. You're affecting me, and I'm going to go hide in my safe place until I can bring myself down, until I'm not triggered anymore. And what we teach people is, if you're being triggered, then that is your opportunity. That when that trigger happens, you have an emotion, right? So then when that emotion happens, do you have tools to help you to understand or control that emotion, so that if you don't, then that emotion so many times just becomes a big emotion, right? And then it just goes back into what we call the trigger box, and you don't learn anything. Or if you're a typical male, a stoic male or whatnot, and actually we see a lot of women that do this too. They'll compartmentalize, which is just a fancy way of saying ignore. Or we can get curious, and curiosity is interesting because curiosity is an emotion that is also part of the cognition. So that curiosity can metamorphosize into a cognitive thinking about, why am I feeling this? What is going on? What is this touching, so that now all of a sudden that it's affecting me in the way that it is? We call it peeling the onion. And we start peeling the onion because the things that trigger us are really, because if you think about who typically triggers us in the biggest ways, our loved ones.
Yeah. People closest to us.
The people that are closest to us. Well, why are they the ones? Because they're the ones that we feel the safest with. And when that safe person says something to us that hits that trigger, the reality is it's not what they said. It's what it touched inside of us.
100%.
That then made us. And if we don't get curious, if we just go to the big emotion, then we don't learn anything. But if we get curious and we start peeling that onion, why am I feeling this way? Where is this coming from? Why is this hitting me so hard? Then it's a phenomenal tool for looking and getting into that optic of self, of where that is, and getting that self-discovery. And many times it can be huge epiphanal moments. I know for me, as well as other people we've taught this to, they have this, they get really big-eyed, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it takes days, weeks, months, but you continue to peel that onion and you go, oh, that's why that is. But it all starts with curiosity.
I love that. Yeah, this is huge for me, because everybody's a mirror. And if you say something to me that I have any sort of a reaction to, it has nothing to do with you, frankly. And you could, even if you're making it personal, it ultimately is just something you said. I connect with it in one form or another. I might not consciously know what it is, but there's something that's, if I, for example, have a negative reaction or an unpleasant reaction, I'm somehow connecting in with what you're saying, or I have a belief about what you're saying, or it could be it could be a number of different things. For example, I used to be really heavy. I was severely overweight. And anytime anybody mentioned anything about weight, health, fitness, insecurities would kick in. They're talking about me, personalizing it, had this whole thing around it. Where today is I've gotten in pretty phenomenal shape of where I'm at today. It's like if someone says something about it has nothing to do with me, or someone could even say, hey, you're fat, or you're this, that. It would go in one ear and out the other. It's like, it's like, I don't connect in that as an example, but I have found now that, again, I love this with curiosity, is many times if I have a reaction to anything that anybody says, there's something for me to look at. It has nothing to do with that. And it's empowering when you can actually control your mind, and take radical accountability for my emotions, because at the end of the day, we want to blame other people that I feel this way because you did this and I feel this way. It's like, it's still a choice, and it's giving your power away. And it's so empowering when you can just recognize that if my reaction's mine, and that's something for me to look at, again, stemming from curiosity.
Yeah. And when we talk about, that's accountability, right? What was my part in this? What did I make this mean about me? So what we teach is, like, for connected relationships, And connected relationships are, we call it AVAR, authentic, vulnerable, accountable, and reciprocal. And so what does that mean, right? So that means that the accountable, vulnerable, authentic, vulnerable, accountable, reciprocal means that in a connected relationship, if you're vulnerable with me, or you come to me and you tell me what part, what you made it mean against you, I'm not going to weaponize that later on. I'm not then going to come back around and say, well, you remember that one time that you did this and I didn't like that. Or I'm not going to go and tell my buddies something that you told me in confidence. So it's that intimate relationship where safety exists, where there's nurturing, where there's loyalty, where that connected community exists. And so that allows you to identify who in your life that you have that you can be authentic, vulnerable, accountable, and reciprocal with, because it starts with self, right? You have to be authentic, vulnerable, and accountable with self, the mirror, like what you said, and then you have that intimate group that's there. And the reality is that's probably only about 3-4 people in your life. And then you have friends where they're kind of a little bit, maybe they're authentic, but they're not really vulnerable, or maybe they're accountable. And accountable is not admitting something. Accountable is exactly what you said. It's what was I making this mean against about me? What was my part to play in that? Why did I blow up when the reality is it wasn't that big of a deal?
Why do you feel it's so hard for people to be accountable? Why is accountability so challenging for people?
Because I think as human beings, we have this drive to be right. We want to be right, and it's partially it's a survival, instinct
Some of
that
it
we
say
have.
it's your ego.
It's your ego, but your ego is there to protect you. So the ego exists. So overcoming the ego is understanding the ego. Overcoming the ego is not erasing the ego. Because if we don't have the ego that's there, then we don't have the protector. So it goes into judgment, right? So don't judge other people. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Judgment is not the lack of discernment. So going into a relationship and not judging. So judgment means that I've been scarred by the past, and those negative patterns from the past are continuing with me today. So I was hurt, or I was betrayed, whatever, in the past. And now, before I go into relationships, I'm going into relationships saying no. So this is Richard Rohr. I'm going into relationships saying no. Well, the problem that happens when I do that is I'm always holding back. I'm never getting in that connected relationship that I can be AVAR with those other people. And so, but what we want to do is when I'm not judging, I go into a relationship saying yes, but that doesn't mean that I give up all of my discernment. It just means that I go in with an open heart and an open mind so that I can receive, and so that I can learn, so that I can continue to progress on who I am as a human being. Does that make sense?
No, totally.
So now when I go into that relationship, if I go in with a yes, there doesn't mean that I don't have discernment. I go in with a yes, and then all of a sudden you're saying stuff, and I'm like, that doesn't add up. This person is probably not being honest with me, authentic. He's not being authentic. They're not being vulnerable. They're not being accountable. Okay, well, I know where I can put them in what we call the rings of relationships, and it allows me to kind of triage or categorize where that person may be. I still have discernment of where that person is, but I didn't go into the relationship saying no, because I'm not going in being judgmental. So Ted Lasso, there was a fantastic scene in Ted Lasso, the show, that just really stuck with me, where he's playing darts with the guy, and I don't know if you've seen Ted Lasso, but he's a coach, and he goes to England, and one of the guys hates him, and he goes into it, and he's like, when you think you've got it all figured out and you have all the answers, you judge everybody around you. And so, and there's this great, I believe it's Walt Whitman, that said, "Don't judge, be curious." And that epitomizes exactly what we're talking about. Whereas if I'm judging everybody that's around me, I'm going in saying no, and I'm going to miss these key lessons in life that I can learn from other people. That's why human beings were at the top of the food chain, because we learn from each other, we share. But if I'm constantly saying no because I think I've got it all figured out, I stymie my awareness that then doesn't allow me to progress later on in life.
I think also when you go down this, we'll call it self-discovery path, or taking charge of your own emotions and radical accountability for self. And, it's when you start to go down that and you become so aware, you also recognize many people, I would argue most people in many ways, are not self-aware. And I've noticed this with me is like, again, and I've learned this the hard way through many life challenges and failures and setbacks. Name the list, but what I've come to a conclusion today is like, we're all on a different path. We're all at different, seasons of healing, of self-discovery, whatever. And who am I? Like, for example, this is what worked for me, but who am I to really say this is the path that you need to take? We get in this space, like, I know what's right. I know what's best. And it's like, well, but do you really know what's best for me? There might be some similar paths that you could take, such as me, or you might be able to do this or that. But at the end of the day, like, we're all on our own journey. And what's been really good for me to really connect with people, regardless of wherever they are in life, is just like, I actually don't know. Like, ultimately, you need to decide it. You're on your own life's path. But when I've approached it from that, I believe I take judgment out of it. And I can see somebody completely self-sabotaging and blowing their whole life up. And I look at that today, it's like, well, you're going to learn. Like, whatever lesson you need to learn in that. And I will offer advice if you'd like it. I can offer suggestions, but ultimately you get to choose what that is. And I think we do. We live in a society that's very judgmental, that, and my belief a lot around judgment many times is, when someone's judging somebody for doing whatever, many times there's another message that's behind that judgment.
Yeah.
Right. We talk about the mirror back. It's like, well, what? It's
there
like,
you
you could be judging somebody for saying, on social media, something that's very polarizing or whatever, and you have a whole issue with the message. But really, maybe the underlying thing is like, man, you actually wish you could be someone that would stand up in your power and get online and be that bold, knowing that you might get hate, and it's like that person's actually representing something that you're not, or frankly would like, but don't have the power or the strength to do it.
It's kind of, I think it was Churchill that said, "Oh, you have enemies? Good. That means you stood for something once in your life." And we call it planting your flag. And it's interesting. So many people have hesitancy planting their flag because they're worried about what the collective is going to say. And because the collective tends, remember, because we have this desire that we're right, but your journey's not my journey. And the tools and practices that I have may help you, maybe not. I want to share them with you, but also I want that to be reciprocal. I want it to be Avar. I want it to be reciprocal because I want you to share the lessons with me that you've learned, because you've got a completely different perspective and point of view that's going through life. But those little tidbits that are there, if we share back and forth, open heart, open mind, and I'm receptive because I'm curious, it's like, hey, how did you do this? Oh, and then I get in and I start using those practices. Then all of a sudden that is what elevates us. But you've got to have that. You've got to have the open heart and the open mind, and unfortunately, we tend to gravitate towards, the shock factor that's out there, and we tend to, it's like the crabs in the bucket, right? All you need is two crabs in the bucket, and you don't need a lid, because one crab will start crawling out and the other one will grab it and pull it back down. And as human beings, we can be that way. And that's where I say the single most powerful thing that we can do for ourselves and for the people that are around us, especially the people we love, is set the example. That doesn't mean you have to be Buddha or Jesus or, whoever, the perfect being. It just means you're doing the best that you can. And it's like, and then when you fail, you circle back, like in Zen meditation, right? Zen meditation can be summed up in close your eyes, get in a quiet place, count your breath. When you get to 10, start over again and count to 10 again. And then it says in the teachings, it says, and when your mind wanders, it's not if your mind wanders, it's and when your mind wanders, just gently pull it back on and start counting again. And so when you screw up in life, It's okay. Gently pull it back on. Do hard things, but be gentle on yourself. And it's like, oh boy, I got off path there. What did I learn from that? And progress.
Yeah, I love like, who'd you say? Winston Churchill said it, stake your, is that what you said? Who
Yeah,
said,
you have enemies. Great. That means you stood for something once.
you know, me, for most of my life, my worth was tied to other people's opinions of me. I'm a recovering people pleaser. I mean, everything. I mean, saying yes to everything. And, you know, I actually used to, you know, prior to doing this, I had an investment firm, and I used to actually brag about this, which is the irony in this today, but I would say I'm a chameleon. Like, take politics, for example. So if I had a very left-winging client, I always like to poke for a minute, but then I would like just kind of lean more into them to connect with them. On the flip side, if I had someone way to the right, I'd poke a little bit to have fun, but I would lean more into that. And the reality was I didn't have the confidence in myself just to be like, no, this is how I feel. And it's okay if we don't see things the same way. I just thought, oh, they're going to see me differently. They're not going to, we're not going to be able to connect. And excuse me. And it was, frankly, it was exhausting because I found myself almost shape shifting and showing up differently for different people, trying to placate them because my worth was tied to them. And then, then going through some pretty traumatic stuff. And it's like, now I have this blank canvas. It's like, well, who the hell am I? And who do I want to be? And it's like, I just want to be me. And it's okay if you don't like me. And what I always have to tell myself is like, hey, there's a lot of people I don't like either. So who am I to think that everyone's going to like me when I, in fact, don't like? That's just life. And it's such a freeing and empowering space to be where it's just like, yes, I still care what people think. I mean, if anyone that says that they don't care is a raging narcissist, but ultimately I don't care what other people think more than what I think about myself. And that's been the biggest differentiator, because before it was just what everybody else thinks. And then, oh, they think I'm that way, then I must be that. I mean, it's sad really, but having experienced both sides of it, it's very freeing. I just want to be me. I want to be authentically me. And if you're into me, great. If not, that's okay too.
And I think so many times we confuse people pleasing with service. And service is super important, don't get me wrong. As a matter of fact, in psychology, service is known as the trifecta of happiness. And so when we serve other people, we get dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin that flow from our body. So dopamine is happiness, serotonin is contentment, and oxytocin is love. Real broad brushstrokes here. But the problem that we run into, I think it was Jung that said that if we give everything to the people that we love, we'll end up despising them, because we end up giving from a cup that is empty.
Yeah, resentment. I experienced that.
We create resentment that's there, and that's where we have to be able to fill our own cup. And when our cup overflows, it's like Jesus said, not to be, religious, but it's like my cup overflows. He was able to give so much, whether you believe in him as a man or you just believe in him as the philosophy. The cup is overflowing so that he can be free with what it is that he's helping other people with. And for us, I think there's a big lesson that's there. If we don't take care of self, then ultimately what happens is we're not doing anybody any good, and we end up being the weak link in the chain. Because if I don't take care of myself and my health and I'm sick in bed, somebody's got to take care of me. Somebody's going to worry about me. I'm using up resources for my family that otherwise wouldn't have been. And this doesn't mean that I'm become a selfish jerk. It just means that I figure out and I schedule that point in my day where it's like, you know what? I need to get out and I need to walk. I need sunshine, but I need time with my kids. Well, that's okay. Grab your kids and take them walking with you too. Walking, I'm a big believer in walking for exercise as well as other stuff. But it's now all of a sudden we get a little bit creative. We bring that curiosity in. So curiosity begets creativity. And so we get that creativity that we bring that together. And it's like, okay, how do I stack, is what we call it. How do I stack these different things that I need to do in life so that I can accomplish as much as possible? Well, it can be overwhelming if we take them one at a time. But if I go walking and I take my kids with me and I have a great conversation that it's there, and maybe I'm lifting, I'm doing dumbbells or whatever, but you get the idea that's there. So now all of a sudden I'm taking care of self while I'm taking care of my family. That's the most important thing to me, and my cup is overflowing not just empty, that's creating that resentment.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Let's talk about your book. You got this book that's coming out, and it's going to be a movie here soon.
Yeah, the 20th. So we're actually, the premiere in Salt Lake is tonight, and then the movie releases on the 20th of this month. So next month.
Yeah.
Or, next week.
And the time of this is going to air next week. So basically this week, it's going live. So tell us about the book and tell us about the movie.
So the book is Black Autumn. So it's post-apocalyptic fiction. And book 1 is Black Autumn. Book 2 is White Wasteland. Book 3 is Blood Spring. And then in between book 1 and 2, there's novellas. And then between book 2 and book 3, there's novellas that are in there. So it's a 9-book total series that's there. And there's kind of a funny story behind writing the books, but it's, it's prepper fiction, it's post-apocalyptic fiction, and then we were blessed enough that Angel Studios picked up the movie. So Angel Studios, who did The Chosen and Sound of Freedom and a couple of other movies that are picking up steam or have done a lot of steam up to this point, they saw that it was good, and so The Homestead is the name of the movie, and then later on, The Homestead will become a series on Angel, but it's Black Autumn is more the tactical emergency preparedness, but we really worked hard to show that even though you think you're right and you've got everything figured out, you don't have everything figured out, and the characters are flawed, and it really captures that we need each other as a community. You can't do it as the lone wolf or any of this stuff. That we need that community. And then White Wasteland, we actually go into the so that's more of the physical aspect, and then in White Wasteland we go into the psychological, emotional aspect of dark times, like the dark ages, so to speak.
Awesome. When in your experience with your retreats, the military, you work a lot with men. What do you think is the number one? Well, maybe not number one. What is the common thread that you see with maybe even yourself, with the men that you work with, that is holding them back from having whatever they want or being whoever they want? What's the number one thing you're seeing there?
The biggest, probably the most common theme or thread that we see is, like, dudes overwhelmingly think they're alone. They overwhelmingly think that I've got to keep all of this stuff buttoned inside. A lot of. I just heard this statistic the other day. It's like 80 or 90% of men, their best friend is their wife, and then interesting that like women, it's only about 50% of women think their husband is their best friend, and that's not a hit against women. It's just a different perspective, because I think men's circle of friends is actually typically pretty small. When I talk about friends, I talk about like intimate friends, intimate friends that are there. And so I think a lot of times men are holding a lot of stuff inside. We hear over and over again from guys. So as a matter of fact, we had a guy that came to the retreat. He's 65 years old. Came there because he was like, I just want to be better. He is a blue collar worker that became like a supervisor. You can't name a piece of machinery that this guy wasn't an expert with front loader or whatever that is. And he went, and we went through. We're about a day and a half into the retreat, and he pulled my wife off to the side, and he goes, if I had known that other people were struggling with the same stuff that I was struggling with, he's like, my life would be very different in a positive way. He's like, I've been holding all this in because I thought it was just me, and I didn't realize that my struggles were kind of this ubiquitous struggle that exists throughout all, like, men and women. Women are just way better at talking about it than guys are.
Oh, for sure.
And guys, we compartmentalize, right? And so it's like, oh, we've got to be stoic, and we got to compartmentalize. And there's a valid argument for that, right? Because we're the stone of the family, the rock of the family that's there. But it also can run into some issues. I'll tell you, like, we worry so much that our kids are going to see, see us as somebody that's flawed. And I can tell you, like, it is a way that you can gain incredible connection with your kids. I was in bed one night and I was on my phone, and it was the fall of Kabul. And so Kabul's falling, and I'm getting dozens of messages. I'm sitting in my house in Utah. I'm getting dozens of messages from these guys I worked with for over a decade saying, please help me, please save my family, because they're talking to me on WhatsApp. And I'm trying to, it's like, what can I do in Utah? And I'm trying to reach out to guys that I know that are over there. And my son is sitting next to me, and he's like, Dad, let me see your phone. Dad, let me see your phone. And I'm sitting here, and they're sending me pictures of people getting murdered. And they're like, look, they're killing us. Can you help us? Please help save my family. So tremendous amount of, it's like, oh my gosh. So I'm reaching out, and my son, he was 7 years old at the time. He's like, Dad, let me see your phone. I want to see a YouTube video or something. And I was like, just a minute. And he's like, Dad. And in a not very good dad moment, I blew up. I was like, I looked at him. I was like, people are dying, and they're asking me for help. And I had pictures of bodies on my phone. And, and I'm not proud of this. And I was like, can you see how important this is? It's not a video game that I'm doing. And, and he kind of stopped, and he looked, and I sat up on the side of my bed, and I had tears running down my face, because these are my friends. These are guys, these are Afghans I fought alongside with for years and years and years. And it actually turned into a very proud dad moment, because my son came up behind me and tapped me, and he said, Dad, it's okay. I understand. Do what you can. And I think it's those moments that if we suppress those moments, and our kids don't see the humanity of us or our wives or our AVAR community, then all of a sudden we miss these moments that we can really catapult ourselves forward, because that turned into what could have been an incredibly embarrassing moment to one of the proudest moments of my life, where my son was now, consoling me over a very stressful, emotional, psychological event that was taking place. And that can only happen if we build that where we're vulnerable and accountable and authentic.
I love that. What's coming to mind. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. I grew up in a house, so my dad never showed emotions, never saw my dad, if I ever did cry, which was, I could probably count on one hand for the, 20 years or so. And it was like, oh my God, like, okay, like there's something here, because we didn't ever really see that side of it. It was interesting getting married and having kids. I didn't show that side of me a lot. And and then going through a divorce and kind of going through life's, big things, it's like I became much more comfortable just being open and dispelling this story, if you will, that I had to show up a certain way, and that I'm the rock, I'm this. And it's like, yes, I want to be that guy, but I'm also human, and I have insecurities, and I have struggles, and I can be a mess sometimes. And it's, I've got I have 4 sons. I have such an incredible relationship with them, but a lot of it's rooted in my own vulnerability. And to be able to share that, I had an experience. It was such a beautiful experience. So when I was married, towards the end of my marriage, we were in, where were we? Cancun. And we went to this water park, and I was miserable. Like, marriage isn't good, obese, severely overweight. I didn't want to participate in anything. So I was just a mugwump, frankly, the whole day. And, so fast forward, divorce, getting in shape. I take my kids back there like 4 years later, whatever, have the time of our life. And it was this just playing, having fun, all the things. And my 17-year-old son, Kingston, I call him my Latin. There's no filter with him. So throughout the entire day, and has a memory like no one else, he's like, hey, Dad, that's the chair you fell asleep in. Hey, Dad, he just pointed out the entire day of how I didn't show up for my family years before. I'm having a whole thing around it. And I'm just like, beating myself up, just this getting down on myself and beat myself up, but then also so much gratitude and kind of the duality of both of it, those experiences. And we were in the taxi on the way back to the hotel, and I just broke down, started crying. And I'm like, I am so sorry for how I used to show up as a father. I'm so sorry. And I'll never forget this. My oldest son looked at me and he goes, but that's not who you are today. It was so touching. Again, the power of vulnerability and showing that side of me. Yeah. And for any of those that have a strained relationship or with their, kids are resilient. They're family. They're part of our blood. And it's like when you can show that human side and you can show that you can change and you can show your emotions, the intimacy, if you will, the connection that can happen goes to levels you wouldn't have ever thought possible by expressing and sharing those vulnerable moments. It was such a touching thing, and I'll cherish that moment the rest of my life. And I'm really proud of how I'm showing up today. And I'm not proud of how I've shown up before, but I'm grateful for the lessons and the things that I experienced it, and that vulnerability, that openness. And there's been multiple times where my kids have consoled me and held me, and it's just like, it's beautiful.
And I think it's one of those, it's like, how many times have you heard from a parent, a friend, a spouse, where they were like, gosh, something happens. And the response is like, gosh, I didn't know. I wish they had said something to me. But if we don't step forward, right? So this, like, to bring this full circle, right? Is it scary to do that? Yeah, it is. There's a lot of fear. Is it also, but courageous is doing it anyways. Setting that example is not an easy thing to do. And if we want our kids to talk to us, if they're having a hard time, or our spouse or our friends, because they're having a hard time, like veteran suicide's a very real thing, right? So kind of taking this to the extreme. And so many times people say, man, I wish they'd just said something. I had no idea. But if you don't set the example where they know that they can do that, where they can follow your lead, that infantry thing, follow me. If they don't know that they can't follow your lead, then they're not going to. And so you remember me talking about sitting on that helicopter.
Yeah.
Where I was sitting on that helicopter, because the next part of that story is we landed and I stood up and I looked at my guys and it was like, okay, let's go. Here we go. And I was the first one off the helicopter running towards the target with them behind me, because I was setting the example. Well, the same thing, you can extrapolate that. If you never are vulnerable, accountable, if you're never authentic, vulnerable, and accountable with your kids, then how do you expect them to be that way with you when they're having a hard time? Mm-hmm. You can't, because they have no example to follow. They have no lessons. They have no tools. They have no practices. And so that's where I can look at like your dad, and I can look at my parents, like my dad's 88 years old and stuff. And it's like, did he have that stuff? No, because he didn't have the tools, because he was coming from a father that, they lived in cabins with dirt floors. Yep. And super hard life, and they weren't being money. And it was like, so all of a sudden it's this, what tools were they bringing with them to help regulate their nervous system? And many times it's like none. The only tool they had was compartmentalize that crap, shove it down, and go to work the next day so you can pay your bills. That has its place. But if we want our kids to be authentic, vulnerable, and accountable with us, especially when they run into hard times, because it is a hard time to be a kid. Mm-hmm. It is a hard time. I would argue it's more difficult to be a kid now than in, the last few hundred years. Not that they're going to starve to death, but I think rather than starve to death, they're going to be poisoned by all of the chemicals and by all of the bad information that's out there about diet that we're now just finding out about, and all of the easy dopamine distractions that exist in the world, that this miracle of a tool that we carry around in our pockets is also can be a curse that's going to drag you down under. When we see the youth suicide rate is skyrocketing by being caused by social media. It is a difficult time to be a kid. And if their parents, dad, is not there setting the example, not of stoicism. You can be stoic and still be authentic, vulnerable, and accountable. You can. And I would argue that's the only way you can truly be stoic, is they need that example to follow. I think it's a must.
No, I what you just said, shout it from the rooftops. You can be both. And I think in today's world, like for a man, especially to be like in his masculine, like truly grounded and like, someone called it a divine masculine. It's the ability to be stoic, the ability to be strong, but then also have the vulnerability, the accountability, the openness. Easier said than done, but when you're in that space, I mean that's ultimately that will bring everybody together. Your wife, your kids, that you can be grounded, stoic, but then also create safe space to just be, and to be. It's okay to not be okay, and let's talk about it. It creates safety for them to be open and vulnerable. And with my kids, I've got a thing we call it the circle of trust, and kind of stole it from Meet the Fockers, where my rule with them is like they will never have any additional consequences or ever get in trouble for anything as long as they tell the truth and within the circle of trust. Now, there's obviously consequences that they'll pay for whatever action they've done or not done, positive or negative. That's for them to work out, but they're not going to get anything additional from me. I want to create a safe space. And also within the circle of trust, you can ask me anything. You'll get the truth. My expectation, because it's an agreement, you do the same thing. So we've created this safety container, though I have conversations with my kids that frankly I never would have had with my father. I'm not talking to him about this. I'm not talking about this. Whether it's, things at school or sex or girls or whatever it happens to be, it's like we talk about it and we're open about it, and they feel safe sharing that because they're not going to get in trouble. And mind you, there's moments where I'm just like, I don't like, all right, Adam, this is the agreement, and so when you can create that safety for them and that it's okay to be vulnerable and open, more often than not, I found that my kids aren't being, what's the word, where they're not rebelling or I'm doing this almost in some a subconscious way to get back at mom. It's like, no, they in some ways are much more independent. They're making decisions on their own and they're figuring out, on their own life path, but they're way more in alignment, I believe, than a lot of kids because of the safe container that we've created, like, through vulnerability, accountability. So I honor that.
I mean, like many times, obviously not every time, but many times when kids are being rebellious, what is it that they're doing?
Trying to get attention.
They want attention. They want attention. And so what you've done with your circle of trust, right, is you've created a boundary, and you've set in an agreement that's there that said whatever is said here will not be weaponized. So it's safe. So now all of a sudden, that's incredibly important like Zen meditation, because when they start struggling in life, when they have those struggles in life that come up, because they will, now all of a sudden they'll come and talk to you and not go and talk to who knows who that's going to give them who knows what kind of advice that they're going to have. And you're not going to be standing there going, man, I wish I had only known, because you've set that example that's there. It's incredibly powerful.
Jeff, where can our listeners, people, where can they find out more about you and all the great things that you're doing?
You can go to mustangmedicine.com, is where the retreat is located there. There's a little bio there. And then I'm in the process of, to my chagrin, of getting reintroduced back into social media. I kind of took a hiatus for a few years and kind of limited my exposure there while I was going to school and whatnot. And admittedly, social media didn't like me very much, so I had several pages that got deleted by the social media overlords.
Yeah,
I guess they didn't dig what I was saying, but Mustang Medicine is probably the best place to find me.
And your book that's being made into a movie right now is
Black Autumn, so that's available on readyman.com or on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and get that, and the movie is Homestead, from Angel Studios,
which launches this week as this goes live. So Jeff, I want to thank you for, again, your vulnerability. Like, what I love about you, just getting to know you here today is, you mentioned this earlier, is that's stoic. I mean, you're a badass, military, 28 years, all this stuff, but there's like this soft and gentle side to you that you've been able to kind of integrate and embody both sides of that there's a time to be strong and wear the armor, if you will. And also there's a time to take the armor off. And my biggest thing, not only with the guys that I'm working with, and one of the things I really want to be able to, let our listeners know, specifically men, is like, it's okay to take the armor off. It's okay. You don't always have to be so rigid. And by taking the armor off, I mean, we're all human, and there's safety in that. There's connectedness in that. And, and like you said, there's a time to put it on, but it doesn't need to be on 24 hours a day, because ultimately when we get into that headspace, the armor becomes too heavy and will collapse. And
there's a great story. I'll tell you, 30 seconds.
Yeah, do it.
There's a movie that came out. It was called Masada, that was about the insurgency of Jews that had escaped Jerusalem, and the Romans were going after them. And they went to this fortress that was on top of a mesa. And anyways, the Romans, it's a long story. It's a great story. And the Romans built a Herculean effort, built a ramp up to the top of this thing where they could get a siege tower up there and bash the wall in there. And so they come up there with a battering ram. They've built this ramp, and they get the battering ram, and they're smashing the wall so that the Romans can get into the fortress. And at one point, one of the Jews is there, and he's talking to the leader. He's like, what are we going to do? We've got to get rocks and make this harder and stronger. And he looked at him, he goes, no, what we need to do is make it softer. And the guy was like, huh? And so they got wooden beams and put these wooden beams in place. And the battering ram, no matter how hard they hit, it was like punching a pillow. And the beams wouldn't move. And then, the rest of the story of Masada. So I just say that because sometimes soft is the armor that you need, that you will get you through life.
I love that. Awesome. And that's such a great way to end. Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for all of you listening to the Burnout Podcast. We'll see you next time.